5, the final of our heart rate training zone series that we've been doing over the last few weeks. And so I'll pass over to you, Nick, to give us a wee intro into zone 5.
Cool. So if you've been, I guess, keeping score from a percentage of lactic threshold point of view, you will know that we are now at 100%. And zone 5 kind of kicks off from that 100% mark. So anything above 100%, you're going to be working, well, I guess, with a mixed energy system. So you're going to be producing lactate at a level potentially that your body's not clearing quite as quickly. So we're into a lot shorter, we're into a lot harder, more intense, more taxing kind of training zones and training percentages. And the first one of those is essentially a VO2 max. So most of you probably are familiar with the term VO2 max, but you might not actually understand what it means. So the VO2 max is essentially the volume of oxygen that you can consume in a minute of exercise, and it is specific to your body weight as well. So it generally is expressed as a milliliters of oxygen per kg of body weight. So when we're looking at this 100 to kind of about 105% of your lactic threshold, it's a VO2 max of around, 4 to 5 minutes, 5 minutes for your highly trained athletes in terms of sustainability. And then you need to back off and have some pretty easy recovery, pretty much in that 1-to-1 ratio. So if it was a 3-minute interval, then you got 3 minutes recovery. The beautiful thing that I love about VO2 is you can kind of go again quite quickly. As long as you get to a point of, I guess, exhaustion or maximally out within that percentage, then you can recover and go again quite quickly. And you tend to get the same sort of result each time. There is obviously a period of time you can't just keep doing that on and off throughout the day. But if you look at VO2 Max Testing, which is often done in a lab, you've got a gas mask and analysis going on. You can kind of get to a VO2 max point over what they call a ramp test, which is stepping up the intensity every few minutes until you get to a point of exhaustion. Once you've recovered from that, again in that sort of 20-minute, so generally the tests are 15 to 20 minutes, 20 minutes recovery, you can go again and get to pretty much the same point, which is quite cool. But I've rambled a little bit there, so I'm going to let Maddie step in and give us an explanation of this from the energy systems point of view.
So back to the energy systems. It always comes back to the energy systems, and with training zones, that's the whole point of having training zones and monitoring our training intensities, so that we can make sure we're exploiting or tapping into the right energy systems to do the types of training that are going to give us the adaptations that we're after. So as Nick said, VO2 max is simply that maximal level of oxygen that your body can uptake and use. And it relies on a couple of different factors. There is the consumption of the oxygen, so breathing it in. It includes our heart, our lungs, the amount of blood that we have to transport the oxygen. And then also at the muscle, having enough of those, or having a number of those mitochondria to uptake and use the oxygen. So when we're training in zone 5, what we're trying to do is stress that delivery system and also the usage system at the other end. So you can think of those little mitochondria in your muscles as the powerhouses or the power stations of your body. They're the things that are producing aerobic energy. And then all the blood and the oxygen being delivered to them, it's kind of like the transport. If you think of a coal-fired power station, this is the trucks taking the truckloads of coal to the power stations to then burn and produce energy. We're taking oxygen to those power stations, and then they use, or in this case, carbohydrate to produce their energy at this intensity, gives us energy to move. So with our energy systems, if we remember back to a couple of episodes ago, we talked about having 3 different pots boiling on the top of a stove, and that we've got our PCR system, ATP PCR system boiling away there, and we turn that up whenever we want to do really high intensity efforts, sprints, little surges, little bursts. And then we've got our anaerobic glycolytic system that's going to produce that lactate, and that's simmering away there as well. when we want to put in a bit of a burner as well, we dial that up. And then we've got our aerobic energy system pot boiling away. And that sort of underpins everything, and it's always boiling away. And one of the sort of questions I get quite a lot is that if anaerobic threshold happens down in zone 4, then why is it still aerobic, our maximal aerobic capacity, in zone 5? Well, just remember that when you cross over your anaerobic threshold, you're not immediately 100% anaerobic. Remember, when we cross our anaerobic threshold, anaerobic energy production just becomes the predominant way of producing energy. That aerobic energy pot is still boiling away there on the stove at full noise, producing as much aerobic energy as possible. However, that anaerobic energy system is now just kicking into full swing as well, meaning that there's a lot of lactate being produced. So that aerobic energy pot doesn't actually get up to a full boil, a full head of steam if you like, until zone 5. And it only happens for a very short period of time. That's why if we're looking at developing our body's maximal rate of oxygen consumption, or our VO2 max, what we need to do is train it very intensely, because we're looking at stressing the delivery of that oxygen and the use of that oxygen. So it needs to be very intense for a very short period, well, not a very short period of time, but a short period of time relative to, say, our zone 2 training. So around that 3 to 5 minute mark is a really good amount of time. And then we need to have a relatively long period of recovery, that 1-to-1. So if you do a 3-minute effort, you're going to need 3 minutes of recovery. This allows time for our lactate to decrease. Because we are over our anaerobic threshold, lactate is produced. So we need our lactate to decrease so that, one, we can get back up to that maximal intensity to stimulate that aerobic capacity. But then also, if we're getting a lot of lactate accumulating in our body, then we're actually training our anaerobic capacity or anaerobic threshold, and that presence of that lactate shuts down the production of aerobic energy through our mitochondria. So it's really important that we get rid of that lactate so that we can train our VO2 max. If you do want to train your anaerobic capacity, or that ability to withstand lactate, then by all means shorten that recovery down and let it build up. But remember, it's about having that specific outcome or that specific goal of the training session. And if it's VO2 max, you need to let that lactate dissipate so that you can train at the correct intensity.
There you go. How comprehensive does that get, eh? Pretty.
It's probably just confused hopefully it hasn't confused everyone more than we already were.
No, I think and I think I said to this earlier, that the pot analogy really, for me, it still helps me bring home the idea that you're always using all 3 pots essentially, just a little bit different in terms of the percentage from each one, which is really cool.
And when I heard that as well, it's kind of a nice analogy in that if you can imagine you've got a limited amount of gas, because we do in our gas tanks, and so if you turn up, say, our ATP PCR system and put in a massive burst, well, the gas is going to run out really quickly because let's say that pipe has a massive opening and it lets a lot out at one time. Get a massive flame, boils really quickly, but it runs out of gas pretty quick. The aerobic energy system, though, has got a smaller opening where the gas comes out, so it can be longer and more sustained. And once you've turned it up to its max, obviously it does run out eventually, but it's got a longer duration. And then our anaerobic glycolytic system is somewhere in the middle there. So you're constantly juggling these knobs about which one you're going to turn up to get that energy that you need for whatever the given task is. And I guess that's pacing, isn't it?
Mm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is pacing. And I probably wouldn't have picked that myself, but when you talk about the different, I guess, openings, that is exactly what our body's doing from a pacing point of view, regulating our speed and our pace and our power based on how far we want to go.
Yep. And it's not quite as simple, I guess, as a couple of knobs and gas coming out of a pipe, but it gives you a bit of an idea, I guess.
It does, and it's quite I guess with the rise of e-bikes, there's now a lot of them have an app that you can log into and set, hey, I'm going to ride for 4 hours or 7 hours or whatever, and it will set the amount of battery power that it gives you to make sure it holds on for the period of time. And I think that's a really cool analogy for the human body. If we could dial in, right, okay, an ideal pacing strategy for 7 hours is this, and we go out there and we sort of push ourselves maximally within that period of 7 hours, I guess, would be really cool.
That is cool, and we can kind of do that as we talked about last week, didn't we? In terms of as long as we're as pacing in terms of where our anaerobic threshold is, then we should, like if you're saying you're doing a 5-hour race and you stay 10% below your anaerobic threshold for the majority of the race, then you should be right. I guess the problem comes when the human mentality isn't quite as disciplined as an e-bike battery app at regulating the pace. And as soon as the gun goes, everyone's off at a mad rush, and they've got that anaerobic glycolytic gas path turned up to the max, and it's burning through the gas, and there's a lot of byproducts coming off with it as well. And before we know it, we've run out of gas coming out of that pipe, so we just have to put it on the low simmer of the aerobic system.
Yes, cool. So that's, I guess, part one of Zone 5. And now for pretty much all sports that are aerobic based, so in the endurance world that we're talking about, you need some sort of VO2 max training within your training plan. And maybe next week, as we sort of tie everything together, we can look at how that will fit in. But tends to be obviously the more, I guess, sprintier, shorter, punchier kind of races that you're doing, whether it be a half Ironman, half marathon, sprint tries, road cycling races. There's a bigger component of that is harder, sprinty kind of couple of minute bursts, back off for a bit, couple of minutes over here, back off for a few minutes as well, versus your longer steady state races, your full marathons, full Ironmans and so forth. So the more that you require those sort of punchy efforts in your race, the closer to race day you should be doing those punchy efforts. Again, if you're doing the longer steady state, you might want to sort of avoid them in the final sort of 8-week build-up in terms of trying to maximise what you're doing. But part 2 of Zone 5 is our anaerobic capacity. Now this is where things get pretty much, full on maximal, punching out as much as you can do, generally upwards of about 30 seconds. There's not too many people that can go much more than that, and it's a trickier zone because we'd sort of say 106+% of your lactic threshold, but it's really hard to measure that because your heart rate takes a few seconds, sometimes a minute, to actually come up into a zone if you're working really hard. So by the time you've done your maybe 20-second interval, your heart rate's just coming up and just touching the zone, and then you're backing off your power, your speed, whatever sort of discipline you're using. So you really have to trust your mental ability to push yourself as hard as you possibly can, or in terms of bike training, using your power meters, if you are using a power meter, is a good way to be able to tell that, because your power is sort of responsive as per the second versus heart rate, which isn't. So it does take a little bit more practice because you have to make sure that you're pushing yourself as hard as you can. You could do a 20-second burst and think you're going as hard as you can, but you're actually 5 or 10% underneath that, and you're not going to get the benefits of that training. But it is more of a maximal sprint zone, so it's not specific for a lot of endurance racing. Track runners, track cyclists, kayakers of shorter duration, it is quite specific for. And a lot of that can be helped trained through your strength training, but those anaerobic intervals from a capacity point of view need to be really short, really hard, and you just have to kind of trust that you're pushing yourself harder.
And I'd almost say that anything in Zone 5, say if it was a VO2 max interval, I'd just prescribe it as a max effort. Go as hard as you can for, let's say it's 3 minutes. And you sort of know that for 3 minutes, you can once you've done a couple of them, you can pace yourself. It's obviously not a maximal sprint for 3 minutes because you can't maximally sprint for 3 minutes. but you can go maximal for 3 minutes and almost ignore your heart rate, because the heart rate usually takes sort of 30, 45, maybe 60 seconds to respond to work. There's a little bit of a lag there because heart rate's driven by everything that's happening in your body, and that once the body needs more oxygen, then it sort of sends that signal to drive the heart rate up. So you just need to be aware of that lag there, and you'll be well aware of that if you've done some intervals before. You'll find that over that first minute, the heart rate takes a while to respond, even though you're putting in the effort. And so anything in that zone 5 area, I'd just say if it's 3 minutes, just go as hard as you can for 3 minutes. If you're looking at not necessarily developing your VO2 max, but potentially your anaerobic capacity, and the only thing that's different between those two intensities is kind of the duration. So rather than doing a 3-minute interval, you might be doing a 30-second interval, and just go as hard as you can for 30 seconds. There's definitely going to be no response in heart rate from that. So it's kind of just that intensity, or sorry, that time of the intervals and the recovery that differ between the two, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And I still quite like the use of these sort of 30-second to a minute intervals for endurance trainers, not too close to the race day, but in terms of just physically training your mind, essentially, to work hard and to sustain a hard effort and think, okay, right, I'm, blowing smoke, and I've got 20 seconds to go. But I've got to hold on. I've got to get to the minutes. But charging for the line, trying to beat the person ahead of you, type of thing in a race or whatever it might be. They're really good for mentally just making sure you can sustain yourself for a period of time.
Oh yeah, because they hurt.
They do, and it's quite interesting if you do enough of them. You get to a point where you can be like, okay, you know what the time is. Right, this is my 35, 40 seconds, but I've got to hold on to a minute. Every interval tends to be, oh man, it's only 40 seconds, because your body is responding and it's changing in those different systems. The lactate's building up, you can feel the burn, and it's really quite a cool sort of training to do. It doesn't have to be a long session, and you can get quite a good benefit out of them if you utilise them properly. And
it probably should come with the warning that when you do these, the kind of space-time continuum definitely warps a bit, doesn't it? And you're going like as hard as you can, and you look down and you watch, and it's been like 10 seconds, and you're like, oh, come on, surely.
Yeah.
Surely.
But then, you look at your watch and your recovery, and it's like, oh, it can't be 2 minutes already.
Exactly. It goes the opposite way.
It does.
It goes the opposite way. When you're working hard, it just space-time continuum slows down. And then as soon as you hit the recovery, boom, it's like hyperspeed.
Yeah.
It's a weird one. Surely it's something to do with physics and, I don't know, the rest of it.
So another, I guess, way to utilise these zone 5 intervals is if you are short on time in your training. There's some really cool evidence, and I know Maddie's talked about them before, and we'll get him to link over in the show notes to some of the videos that he's done, but utilising 5 or 6, 30-second maximal intervals with a decent sort of, 4.5 minute recovery is equivalent to doing a 60-minute kind of steady state training session from a fuel metabolism point of view, which can be really beneficial if you are crunched for time, if you are stuck inside training, whether it be on a wind trainer or a treadmill due to weather, or because you live in an environment you can't get out and train. It's not going to make you the best endurance athlete in the world if you only do that sort of training. You're going to fall short on a number of bases, but it's a really cool option to be able to utilise to supplement your training at times when you can't get out and do the longer steady state stuff. That's for sure.
I think it's such a good little tool to have in your toolbox, so to speak. And I've used it a lot myself personally, training for long events to when I'm short on time, and simply because I'm quite hyper aware of it, I guess, because I did my masters on it, and I couldn't believe it when I first read about it that you can get similar adaptations to 60 minutes. So a lot of these research studies were done on untrained individuals, which kind of means that they get a lot of benefit from doing not much. So we need to be careful how we apply this to athletes as well. But the idea is if you are short of time, then going harder can kind of make up for the lack of duration. So if you are short of time, doing short, either 30 seconds, even shorter, 20 seconds, doing some minute intervals, making sure that your recovery periods are long enough so that you can hit it hard again afterwards are all really good ways of boosting or maximizing that time if you don't have it. Like Nick said, I wouldn't recommend doing this all of the time. When I've used this for myself or with other athletes who are sort of time poor, so to speak, when we've done a really good block of this training, they get really good race results. But what happens if you start using multiple blocks of this training, we start to see their aerobic base kind of eroding. So you are getting the same benefits, but what we find anecdotally, just in the real world experiences of using this, is that they do lose a little bit of that ability when races do get really, really long. So if you've already got a really good aerobic base, then you can get away with using quite a bit of this time crunched training approach. However, you do need to go back and top up that aerobic base from time to time, and that's where it's quite good to have blocks of good aerobic base development, top it up so that when you do put in these shorter high intensity training blocks, and maybe it's in preparation for a race, or even if you just don't have time, or if it's just a one-off session because let's say you're traveling or something came up at work and you're not able to get your longer session in, then you can use these tools quite effectively. So it is very much a tool for your toolbox and not a one size fits all. I'm just only going to do high intensity interval training because there is that can cause a few issues. If you are looking for some structure around how to use this type of training, we do have a training plan over at exponentialperformancecoaching.com/plans. It's called the Time Saver Cycling Plan. And again, it just builds up over a period of time using these high intensity intervals. You can either run that plan as it's set out, or you can just pick and mix, so to speak, some of the sessions from there, slot them into your training. Like I say, when things crop up and you're not able to do your normal plan training, or you want some options there. Zone 5, done. Mm-hmm. And next week we will follow up with some of the questions we've had about heart rate zone training, and we'll dig into some of those, as well as some of the things you need to watch out for, some of the limitations and some of the problems that crop up with it.